April 11, 1945. The sea is calm but restless, rolling beneath a gray sky off Okinawa. Dawn filters through the mist like smoke from distant fires. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, sailors hurry to their stations. The metallic clang of boots on steel decks echoes through the ship's massive hull. The air smells of salt, oil, and cordite, the scent of a world at war. Above, radar screens hum with life. A blip appears, then another, then too many to count. Bogies inbound, a voice calls over the loudspeaker. Every man freezes for half a second, then moves. Hatches slam shut. Ammunition is passed hand to hand. Gun crews ready, the 14 Bofors, eyes searching the clouds. Far off, the first glint of sunlight catches the wings of a diving plane, a Japanese Zero, streaking downward with its engines screaming. The sound cuts through the roar of the ocean, through the thunder of Missouri's guns. Tracer fire fills the sky, brilliant, chaotic, but the Zero keeps coming. One heartbeat, two. Then a flash of fire, and the steel deck shudders under impact. The Battle of Okinawa had just reached Missouri. By early 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard of empires. The war that began in 1941 with Japan's sudden strike at Pearl Harbor had now reversed its tide. Island by island, mile by mile, the United States was advancing relentlessly westward, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippines, closing the noose around Japan itself. What had once been a vast empire now stood cornered, its supply lines severed, its cities burning under the weight of American air power. Yet Japan did not yield. To surrender was unthinkable. For the military government in Tokyo, every island, every coral atoll became sacred ground to be defended to the last man. In January 1945, American planners turned to the final, most formidable objective before the Japanese home islands, Okinawa. Just 350 miles from Kyushu, it would serve as the perfect staging area for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. To take it, the Allies launched Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. It would dwarf even Normandy in scale. More than 1,300 ships, including over 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and hundreds of support vessels, formed an armada so vast that observers described the horizon as made of steel. At its heart sailed Task Force 58, the U.S. Navy's most powerful striking force, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher and operating under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance of the Fifth Fleet. Task Force 58's mission was brutal and simple: neutralize Japanese airfields, destroy enemy shipping, and shield the invasion fleet from counterattack. In this massive formation of carriers and escorts, fast battleships played a vital role, protecting the flat tops with their formidable anti-aircraft batteries and delivering devastating shore bombardments when called upon. Among these steel giants was a new arrival, USS Missouri, BB-63, the last battleship ever commissioned by the United States Navy. She represented the culmination of decades of naval design, a sleek, powerful Iowa-class vessel capable of reaching 33 knots and unleashing 9 16-inch guns across more than 20 miles. Laid down in 1941, launched in 1944, and now fully operational, Missouri embodied America's industrial might at its wartime peak. Her decks gleamed with fresh paint. Her crew of nearly 3,000 sailors and officers were young but battle-ready, veterans of previous campaigns aboard other ships. To them, the Missouri wasn't just another warship. She was a symbol, a promise that this war, with all its chaos and loss, would soon be won. The battleship joined the Pacific Fleet in early 1945, assigned to Task Force 58. By March, she was operating off the Japanese coast, bombarding targets on Honshu and Kyushu. The closer she moved to Japan, the thicker the air raids became. The Imperial Navy was shattered, but the Imperial Japanese Army and its air service still fought on, determined to exact a final toll on the enemy's advance. When Operation Iceberg began on April 1, 1945, American Marines and soldiers stormed the beaches of Okinawa under heavy artillery fire. Overhead, swarms of carrier-based aircraft swept the skies clean of opposition. Yet the Japanese response came in a form few were prepared to face in such numbers: the kamikaze. For weeks, American radar operators detected waves of suicide aircraft diving toward their fleets. Each was a single, explosive-laden machine, flown by a man who had already accepted death. Some crashed harmlessly into the sea. Others tore through destroyers, carriers, and cruisers with horrifying effect. By the first week of April, over 1,000 kamikaze sorties had been launched. More than 30 American ships had been hit. Each day, the sea erupted in fire, smoke, and shattered steel. Amid this storm, USS Missouri took her position off Okinawa's western coast, standing guard near the carriers of Task Force 58. Her gunners had already claimed several incoming aircraft, but the attacks kept coming, relentless, suicidal, almost impossible to stop. The battleship's massive guns thundered in support of troops ashore, while her smaller batteries filled the air with walls of flak. The sky was a constant mix of contrails, smoke, and burning wreckage. The crew barely slept. Every night, they listened to the low, distant drone of aircraft engines, never knowing if it was friendly or another kamikaze searching for glory in death. By the second week of April, the Missouri's logbooks recorded near-daily air alerts. Sailors joked grimly that the sun never sets on Okinawa's air raid sirens. But the strain was beginning to show. They had seen ships around them explode in seconds, crews lost in fire and oil. They had watched destroyers vanish under the sea. And then came the morning of April 11, 1945, when the radar screens lit up again, showing dozens of contacts rising from the south. This time, the storm would find them directly. The alarm bells began to ring. In Japan, the final phase of the war was a descent into desperation and devotion. The loss of the Philippines had severed vital supply lines from Southeast Asia. The Imperial Navy lay shattered after Leyte Gulf. Yet within the corridors of the Japanese military command, a grim strategy emerged. If Japan could no longer fight with fleets, it would fight with lives. From this resolve came the kamikaze, divine wind. It was not simply a tactic, but a cultural and spiritual phenomenon. To the Japanese High Command, it was a way to fuse the nation's ancient warrior code with modern warfare. The first organized suicide air units had appeared in the Philippines in late 1944, but by 1945, they had grown into entire formations. Hundreds of young pilots, often barely trained, volunteered to sacrifice themselves in defense of the homeland. At Kyushu's airbases, Kanoya, Koshira, and Kairan, pilots prepared in silence. They were given a ceremonial cup of sake, tied white headbands around their foreheads, and boarded planes modified to carry 500-kilogram bombs. Many were in their late teens. They wrote farewell letters home, posed for photographs, and then climbed into cockpits knowing they would never return. To them, the sea around Okinawa was sacred, the last shield of Japan. To the Americans sailing into it, it was the most dangerous place on Earth. The Okinawa campaign saw the largest concentration of kamikaze attacks in the entire war. Over 1,900 Japanese planes were committed to the operation, grouped into waves designed to overwhelm the American fleet's radar and anti-aircraft defenses. For the first time, the suicide planes were coordinated with conventional attacks, creating chaos across the horizon. Task Force 58 bore the brunt of these assaults. Carriers like Enterprise, Bunker Hill, and Essex fought for survival as hundreds of Zeros and dive bombers plunged from the clouds. Each attack was unpredictable, sometimes a single plane, sometimes dozens coming at once from every direction. For the men aboard USS Missouri, every day brought the same deadly rhythm: radar alert, general quarters, the shriek of dive sirens, and then the thunder of the ship's guns. Her anti-aircraft crews fired until their shoulders bled, filling the sky with burning fragments of metal. The Missouri's 20 Oerlikon spat flame at low-flying aircraft, while her 14 Bofors tracked the faster ones. Above them, 5-inch dual-purpose guns filled the air with proximity-fused shells, each designed to explode near its target, shredding wings and engines. Despite these defenses, no ship was truly safe. A kamikaze only needed to get through once. In the days leading up to April 11, Missouri had seen several near misses. She watched other vessels hit and burning. The destroyer Bush sank with nearly all hands. The Hancock took a suicide plane to her deck, killing 62. The Enterprise, the Navy's most storied carrier, was struck yet again. The skis over Okinawa had become a death trap for both sides. Still, morale aboard Missouri remained steady. Her captain, William M. Callaghan, maintained discipline and calm. Under him, the crew knew their ship was strong and their firepower unmatched. Missouri's reputation was growing fast, earning her the nickname Mighty Mo. But war has a way of finding even the strongest. At 2:00 p.m. on April 11, radar operators aboard Missouri picked up new contacts, multiple aircraft approaching from the south at low altitude. The men had heard the alarms many times before, but this felt different. The pattern was tight, fast, deliberate. Battle stations were manned, gunners locked in. The ship's loudspeakers blared warnings across the decks. The air around the battleship filled once again with the heavy tension that every sailor knew too well, that space between calm and catastrophe. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a group of young Japanese pilots adjusted their controls, heading straight toward the American fleet. The moment was coming, and this time, Missouri would not escape untouched. Life aboard the USS Missouri was a rhythm of precision, noise, and exhaustion. For months, the crew had lived in a cycle that never changed, a blend of alertness and fatigue that only war at sea could produce. When the ship wasn't under fire, it was preparing for it. The men slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, rocked constantly by the slow heave of the Pacific. Below deck, the air was thick with humidity, sweat, and diesel fumes. When general quarters sounded, they moved as one, thousands of individuals becoming a single machine. In a sailor's diary recovered years later, one line stood out: "You don't think, you just do. The guns are your heartbeat." That heartbeat never truly stopped. Each day brought another alert, another formation of blips on the radar, another fight for survival. The men at the 14 batteries had burns on their hands from the heat of the barrels. The loaders, arms ached from passing shells that weighed nearly 2 pounds each. Gunners learned to read the sky, the subtle movement that meant a plane was diving, the shimmer that revealed sunlight flashing off a wingtip. Even in moments of calm, tension lingered. They played cards beside their guns, joked about home, and smoked in silence, but every man's ear was tuned to the faintest hum of an approaching engine. Missouri was more than a ship. She was a floating city of steel and nerves. Her corridors buzzed with radio operators, cooks, engineers, and medics. Every sailor had a task, every second a purpose. Above them, the bridge hummed with controlled chaos, voices on headsets relaying bearing, altitude, and range. This was modern warfare's new frontier, the fusion of man and machine. At the center of it all stood Missouri's technological core, a marvel of engineering that represented the peak of battleship design. The ship's Mark 37 fire control system connected radar, optical rangefinders, and analog computers, allowing her gunners to track and engage aircraft miles away. Her SK air search radar swept the horizon, detecting incoming planes before the human eye could. The SG surface radar tracked ships and torpedoes. The Mark 8 and Mark 13 directors coordinated the aim of the 5-inch dual-purpose guns, ensuring every shell followed a precise path through the sky. The result was devastating efficiency. The 5-inch/38 caliber guns could hurl a 55-pound shell at 2,700 feet per second, guided by data transmitted from the radar plot room below deck. The 14 Bofors batteries provided a wall of flak, 160 rounds per minute from each barrel, while the 20 Oerlikons spat streams of tracer fire at low-flying attackers. When a kamikaze appeared, these systems activated like clockwork. Spotters called bearings, radar fed distance, fire control computers calculated trajectories. Within seconds, every turret and gun mount on Missouri would adjust automatically, a symphony of mechanical precision and human reflex. The ship's radar officers were the unseen sentinels of this operation. Inside a dimly lit room filled with glowing screens and mechanical dials, they traced tiny blips crawling across the radar scopes. Their voices carried over the intercom, "Bogey, 270 degrees, range 10 miles. Then came the countdown, 8 miles, 5-3, until the guns opened fire. But even the best technology couldn't erase fear. Each man knew that one mistake, one missed target, could mean death for everyone aboard. When the kamikazes broke through the flak curtain, it became a contest of seconds. There was no glory in it, just survival. In the ship's wardroom, conversations turned quieter as the weeks went on. Some men wrote home, others stopped altogether. Letters often came back unopened, marked "return to sender." For the gunners, sleep was an illusion. The noise of battle never faded. At night, they lay awake listening to the ship's engines, the soft vibration of power beneath the steel deck, and wondered if another alarm would sound before dawn. A bosun's mate later recalled, "We thought we'd gotten used to it until we saw what a kamikaze could do to a destroyer. Then you stop pretending you're ready." The emotional toll was as heavy as the guns they manned. Fear was constant but rarely spoken of. Instead, they relied on ritual, cleaning, checking, reloading, mechanical acts that kept the mind from drifting. For all her power, Missouri was vulnerable in the same way every ship was. She floated on faith, steel, and the reflexes of her crew. On April 10, the day before the attack, the sky was overcast, the sea calm. The log recorded several radar contacts that never materialized. Some men began to believe the worst had passed. The officers, however, knew better. The Japanese airfields on Kyushu were still active, and their pilots were growing bolder with every raid. By evening, the Missouri's radar screens were alive again. Faint, distant signals, maybe nothing, maybe everything. The ship maintained readiness through the night. Every gun crew slept beside its weapon, every radar operator stayed at their post. Dawn came with a thin fog rising over the Pacific, shrouding the horizon. It was the calm before the storm, one final breath before history struck. While the Americans braced themselves behind steel and radar, their enemies prepared for battle in a very different way, one guided not by machinery, but by belief. In the spring of 1945, airbases across Kyushu and Formosa became the crucibles of Japan's final defense. The men who trained there were not ordinary pilots. They were Tokatai special attack units sworn to die for the emperor. Their aircraft were patched together relics of an exhausted war industry, outdated Zeros, Hayabusas, and even obsolete trainers fitted with bombs. But the weapon that mattered most was not the plane, it was the will of the man flying it. At the Kairan Air Base, young aviators rose before dawn. They bowed before portraits of the emperor, drank a ceremonial cup of sake, and listened as officers read final orders. Many had barely 20 hours of flight experience. Most were 19 or 20 years old. They wrote farewell letters in neat handwriting, promising their families they would die with a smile. Some attached cherry blossoms to their uniforms, symbols of beauty and impermanence. Before takeoff, they left behind locks of hair and fingernails, proof of existence for the grave that would never hold their bodies. When the engines roared to life, the men in the control tower stood in silence. The planes lifted into the sky one after another, forming small groups, each destined for a one-way journey to Okinawa. They carried not only explosives, but the last hope of a nation that refused to surrender. To American commanders like Admiral Raymond Spruance, these attacks represented a new kind of warfare, one that defied reason. The kamikaze was not a military tactic in the traditional sense. It was an act of collective despair weaponized into strategy. Spruance, a man known for his composure and intellect, viewed the phenomenon with a mix of horror and respect. "They are not insane," he noted in one report. "They are disciplined and they believe." Captain Callaghan, aboard the Missouri, shared similar sentiments. He knew his ship's guns could tear apart any plane that came too close, but he also knew that against a pilot determined to die, even perfect defense was never perfect enough. For the men of the U.S. Navy, facing the kamikaze blurred the line between warfare and sacrifice. It was no longer about defeating an enemy, but surviving an ideology. Moral questions began to surface even among the hardened sailors. What drives a man to willingly die? Is it madness or devotion? Some pitied the Japanese pilots, others cursed them, most simply accepted them as the final, terrible face of the war. The contrast between the two sides was absolute. On one, radar and fire control science turned into defense. On the other, faith and death, spirit turned into a weapon. Both sides were trapped in the same storm, bound by duty, moving toward the same horizon. In early April, intercepted radio signals hinted at something large. Japanese formations were being assembled for another Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, mass suicide assault. U.S. intelligence warned of an impending attack involving hundreds of aircraft. Aboard Missouri, the message spread through the chain of command. Crews were briefed, weapons checked, and ammunition distributed. Every sailor knew what it meant. Another wave was coming. On the morning of April 11, the weather turned clear, the kind of blue sky pilots prayed for. Visibility stretched for miles. The sun glinted on the water like glass. Radar screens began to light up with returning echoes. First a few, then clusters, then a solid mass moving north from Kyushu. The radio crackled with the voices of nearby ships, their tone tightening. Enemy planes inbound. Every gunner's hand went to his weapon. The fire control officers locked in targets. The ocean fell silent for one impossible second, a stillness broken only by the sound of the wind brushing against Missouri's hull. Then came the rising chatter over the ship's radios, clipped, urgent, unmistakable. Multiple bogies, closing fast, range 20 miles. The next storm was already on its way. April 11, 1945, 2:00 p.m. The sun hung sharp over the Pacific, burning through thin clouds. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and gunpowder, the smell of battle. On the horizon, the radar operators aboard USS Missouri, BB-63, called out the first warning, multiple bogies approaching, bearing 180. The sound of alarms cut through the calm. The ship's loudspeakers thundered the words every sailor knew by heart: General Quarters, General Quarters. Men dropped what they were doing and ran. Steel doors slammed shut, watertight compartments sealed. Below deck, the engine room hummed with raw power. Above, the gun crews swung into position. The sea itself seemed to tense, waiting. From the south, the enemy came. 30 Japanese aircraft broke through the haze, a mix of dive bombers and Zeros. Some climbed, others skimmed the waves, splitting apart into small attack groups. Over the radio, voices from other ships filled the air. Contact, multiple incoming. The entire task force erupted to life. Carriers turned into the wind, destroyers maneuvered into screening positions, and every gun aboard Missouri roared awake. The 5-inch dual-purpose guns began their steady thunder, guided by the Mark 37 directors. High above, bursts of black flak pockmarked the sky like storm clouds. Shells exploded in rhythmic succession, 5 seconds apart. Each one calculated to intercept a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Then the 14 Bofors opened up, faster, angrier, filling the air with tracers that streaked red and white through the smoke. Amid the chaos, one Japanese plane, a Mitsubishi Zero, broke formation. Flying low, just above the waves, it slipped beneath the main flak curtain and began to climb toward Missouri's starboard side. The plane's wings shimmered silver against the sun, its propeller a blur. "Zero coming in low," shouted a spotter. The 14 guns turned instantly, spitting fire. Shells ripped through the air, some finding their mark. Holes appeared along the Zero's fuselage, smoke trailing from its engine. But it didn't stop. The pilot kept coming. On the bridge, Captain William M. Callaghan watched through his binoculars, calm but resolute. He gave no order to maneuver. Battleships didn't flinch. Missouri would hold her ground. The Zero climbed slightly, leveled off, and came straight in at the ship's superstructure, engines screaming, flames licking at its tail. The pilot's intent was clear. Within seconds, every gun that could bear opened fire. The sky became a storm of tracers, metal, and sound. Pieces of the aircraft tore away, fragments of wing, panels, debris falling into the sea. Yet still it came, diving now faster and faster, until it filled every man's vision. Then impact. At 2:43 p.m., the Zero struck the starboard side of Missouri, just below the main deck, between frames 160 and 170. The explosion was sharp but brief, a burst of flame, smoke, and debris. The plane's 500-pound bomb failed to detonate, but the crash itself tore a fiery scar across the battleship's hull. Fire erupted instantly, igniting paint, wiring, and loose debris. The sound reverberated through the entire ship, a single violent jolt that knocked men off their feet. For a moment, the bridge was silent. Then came the shouting. Fire on the starboard side. Damage control to frame 160. Medical teams forward. Black smoke poured upward, carried by the wind. The ship's guns kept firing even as crewmen rushed to contain the blaze. The remaining Japanese planes dove toward other ships in the formation, destroyers and carriers now engulfed in the same storm. Missouri's gunners watched the sky through stinging eyes, firing until the last enemy blip vanished from the radar screen. Below deck, men worked furiously to cut off fuel lines and smother flames. The smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with scorched metal and seawater, but the ship, her armor thick and her systems redundant, held strong. When the fire finally subsided, the crew gathered near the impact site. Twisted wreckage clung to the hull, what remained of the kamikaze's wings and engine. Amid the charred metal, they found something unexpected. The pilot's body, thrown clear during the crash, his uniform still intact. He could not have been older than 20. The silence that followed was unlike the chaos before. No cheers, no noise, only the low hum of the ship's engines and the hiss of cooling steel. For the men of the Missouri, the battle was not over, but something had changed. The enemy was no longer just a target. He had a face. A face that had come through fire to meet them. The smoke from the explosion drifted slowly out to sea. On the Missouri's deck, damage control teams worked with quiet urgency. Hoses uncoiled, pumps engaged, and sailors in fireproof suits advanced through the heat and steam. The blaze had been contained, but small fires still licked at the scorched plating. Crewmen coughed through the smoke, their eyes red from fumes. Others carried stretchers, not for the dead, but for the injured who'd been thrown by the blast or burned by flying debris. Despite the violence of the impact, there were no fatalities aboard Missouri that day. The battleship's armor had absorbed the hit, her resilience a testament to the engineering that built her. Yet amid the relief, a strange solemnity settled over the crew. Near the edge of the deck, a group of sailors gathered around the remains of the Japanese pilot. He lay broken but strangely peaceful, his flight suit scorched, a rising sun insignia still visible on his sleeve. Captain Callaghan approached quietly. He stood for a long moment, then gave a simple order: prepare him for burial at sea, treat him with dignity. No one questioned it. The pilot was carried below deck, wrapped respectfully in canvas, weighted with shell casings. A short time later, the crew assembled on the weather deck. The air was calm now, the battle sounds had faded into distant thunder. A Navy chaplain stepped forward and read a short prayer. There were no flags, no speeches, just the rhythmic roll of the ocean and the murmured words of men who had seen too much death to hate the dead. As the canvas slid over the side, the sea accepted the pilot in silence. He had come to kill them, and in the end, they gave him a sailor's farewell. Many aboard would remember that moment for the rest of their lives. It was the strange humanity of war, an act of respect in the aftermath of destruction. The following hours were spent restoring order. Fire crews scrubbed soot from the steel decks. Damaged cables were replaced, paint scraped away, repairs logged and filed. Even as smoke still rose from the starboard side, Missouri's guns remained manned, her radar sweeping continuously. The war around them had not paused for mourning. Reports soon confirmed that the kamikaze's bomb had not detonated, a fact that saved the ship and hundreds of men. Had it gone off, the explosion could have ripped open the deck and ignited the magazines below. By evening, the sea was littered with fragments, bits of wood, twisted aluminum, and oil slicks burning faintly on the water. Other ships in the formation signaled damage reports. Destroyers had been struck, carriers hit. Yet Missouri, bruised but unbroken, remained at her post. In the wardroom, officers gathered for a brief meeting. No words of triumph were spoken. Captain Callaghan summarized the day in a single sentence for the ship's log: enemy plane destroyed in attack, fire controlled, ship remains operational. Nothing more needed to be said. As night fell, the crew worked quietly, scrubbing blood and oil from the deck. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battleship's hull. In the distance, the faint rumble of artillery echoed from Okinawa, where soldiers fought their own desperate struggle. The day's heat faded, replaced by the chill of the open sea. The Missouri's deck glistened under the moonlight, scarred but clean. Some men paused to look out toward the dark horizon, where the enemy had come from. Others said nothing at all. The war would continue for months yet. More attacks would follow. But for the men aboard the Missouri, April 11th would be remembered not just for fire and impact, but for the strange, quiet act of mercy that followed it. As the last traces of smoke drifted away into the night sky, the ocean returned to its eternal calm. And the mighty Mo, scarred but steadfast, prepared for whatever came next. The smoke of April 11th had long drifted beyond the horizon, but for the men aboard the USS Missouri, the war showed no sign of slowing. Within days of the kamikaze strike, the mighty Mo was back on station off Okinawa, her guns trained toward the shore. The crew had patched the scarred hull, repainted the burn marks, and restored every weapon to readiness. The ship, like the men who served on her, refused to yield to the weight of war. The Battle of Okinawa, launched under the codename Operation Iceberg, was proving to be the fiercest and bloodiest campaign of the Pacific. The island itself, an emerald stretch of ridges, caves, and coral reefs, had become a fortress defended by more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Every ridge and cave hid resistance, but hundreds still found their mark. Destroyers vanished in columns of smoke, carriers burned beneath the sun. Every day brought new reports of loss. Bunker Hill hit, Franklin crippled, Laffey nearly sunk under suicide attacks. The cost was staggering on both sides. Japanese air forces were being annihilated faster than they could be replaced. In desperation, Japan began launching obsolete trainers and even glider bombs, each manned by pilots who knew they would never return. American sailors grew hardened, yet no amount of courage could fully prepare them for the sight of human beings turned into weapons. For Missouri's crew, the April 11 attack had changed something fundamental. Each time the radar reported bogies inbound, they felt the same chill, the same echo of that flaming zero diving toward them. Still, they fought, calmly, methodically, as men who had seen the worst and endured. Through April and May, Missouri's batteries continued to support the invasion. Her big guns fired over 1,000 rounds during the campaign, silencing bunkers and breaking supply lines. Whenever her barrels cooled, she would steam to replenishment areas, load fresh ammunition, and return to the line. The ship had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of persistence, of an empire of steel that advanced no matter how the storm raged. By June, Okinawa was a graveyard. More than 12,000 Americans were dead or missing, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers lay buried in the shattered hills. Civilians suffered horribly, caught between two unstoppable forces. The island, once green, was now gray with ash and cratered earth. As the last pockets of Japanese resistance were destroyed, Missouri turned her guns inland one final time, sending a closing salvo that echoed across the sea. The war had entered its final, desperate phase. Japan's navy was gone, its air power nearly extinguished, but its leaders refused to surrender. The empire still clung to hope for one last decisive battle, one that never came. For the crew of Missouri, the kamikaze scars remained visible reminders of that stubborn defiance. The war was shifting toward its end, but the shadow of Okinawa lingered in every heart. The Pacific, once alive with fire, began to quiet, but it was the silence before history's final reckoning. By late July 1945, the once mighty Japanese empire was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing. Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama burned night after night under waves of American B-29s. The Imperial Navy no longer existed. Its ships lay at the bottom of harbors or rusting in coastal shallows. The skies over Japan belonged entirely to the enemy. And still, there was no surrender. For the men of the USS Missouri, now stationed with the Third Fleet off the Japanese home islands, the war's end felt both near and impossibly distant. They watched as carrier planes struck the mainland daily, flattening shipyards, rail lines, and factories. Missouri herself joined the bombardments, her 16-inch shells thundering against industrial targets near Honshu. Every man aboard knew what was coming next: Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Rumors whispered of hundreds of thousands of casualties. Few expected to survive it. Then, in August, came the unimaginable. On August 6th, news reached the fleet. An entire city had vanished. Hiroshima, obliterated by a single bomb. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. No one aboard Missouri fully understood what had happened, only that a new weapon had ended entire worlds in seconds. The sea grew still. Then came the word that none dared hope for: Japan had agreed to surrender. On August 15, the voice of Emperor Hirohito reached his people over the radio, speaking of enduring the unendurable. Across the Pacific, the guns fell silent. The war, 6 years of global fire, was over. Weeks later, the USS Missouri steamed into Tokyo Bay. The same ship that had been scarred by a kamikaze now became the altar of peace. Her decks were scrubbed spotless, brass polished until it gleamed. Flags snapped crisply in the morning breeze. The crew stood in perfect formation as small boats ferried dignitaries from the shore. On the morning of September 2, 1945, under gray skies, representatives of the Allied powers gathered aboard. General Douglas MacArthur stood at a simple table set on the Missouri's surrender deck, flanked by Admirals Nimitz and Halsey. Opposite them, Japanese delegates arrived in silence. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, his leg crippled from an old wound, leaning on a cane as he stepped forward. The air was still, heavy with history. Every camera, every pair of eyes focused on the moment. At exactly 9:04 a.m., Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the Emperor and the Japanese government. Then General Umezu signed for the Imperial General Staff. MacArthur followed, his signature marking the official end of World War II. As the final pen stroke dried, the Missouri's guns thundered, not in war but in salute. Across Tokyo Bay, the sound echoed off the mountains and returned like a benediction. Allied ships answered in chorus, their whistles and sirens filling the air with a sound that seemed to release the entire Pacific from its long, brutal silence. Many aboard Missouri felt an overwhelming stillness afterward. The ship that had once braced for death now carried peace upon her deck. Some men wept quietly, others simply stared at the horizon, knowing that the world they had fought to restore would never be the same again. The canvas-covered scar on the starboard side remained, the place where the kamikaze had struck months before. It was never polished away, never erased. Instead, it was left as a silent reminder that even in victory, war carried a price beyond words. As the Missouri departed Tokyo Bay days later, the rising sun glimmered faintly across her hull. The mighty Mo had seen the Pacific's darkest hour and now bore witness to its dawn. The war was over, the world, forever changed, began to breathe again. In the stillness after war, the USS Missouri became more than a battleship. She stood as a paradox, forged for destruction, yet forever remembered as the platform of peace. The same decks that had shuddered under the impact of a kamikaze now bore the signatures that ended the world's greatest conflict. Her guns, once thunderous instruments of annihilation, rested silent beneath the soft hum of the Pacific wind. The scar left by the Japanese plane remained, not as damage, but as memory. Every dent, every mark upon her steel told a story of courage and tragedy. For the men who had watched that Zero plunge from the clouds, the war had never been about hatred. It was about survival, about holding the line until the killing stopped. The Kamikaze, too, carried its own haunting echo. Each pilot was the embodiment of a nation's final breath, young men sent to die not for conquest, but for a fading vision of honor. Their sacrifice, twisted by desperation, symbolized a culture pushed beyond reason. In their flight toward death, the world glimpsed both devotion and despair, the dual nature of humanity in its darkest hour. Missouri's journey from battlefield to peace table mirrored humanity's own struggle between destruction and understanding. She represented what mankind could achieve: immense power, unmatched engineering, and also what it must remember, that power without conscience brings ruin. As the years passed, Missouri became a museum, moored in quiet waters, her decks open to a world that had learned, at least for a time, the cost of war. Visitors walked where emperors surrendered and sailors once fought for their lives. They touched the same steel, saw the same ocean, and felt the silent presence of those who never returned. And so the mighty Mo endures, a monument not to victory alone, but to the fragile peace that follows. Her story reminds us that history's greatest weapons are also its greatest teachers. Beneath the vast Pacific sky, where the echoes of war once roared, Missouri rests, still and eternal, a witness to both the fury of man and the enduring hope that peace, once won, must never again be lost.